Good morning, all. I hope all is fit and well, and looking forward to this morning's recruitment discussion. And boy, from the sound of it, what a discussion. Those two dreaded words that we all hear in those sales rooms, I've just had the counter offer. They're really horrible words. But today, I think we might be teaching people to suck eggs a little bit, which I hope I apologize for straight away. We hope to jog lots of people's memory on things that we should be doing and could be doing. And we hope to implement some new things that may help you reduce the number of counter offers. So here's the big question that we always get. Do 90% of employees who accept the counter offer still leave after a year? And there's loads and loads of data out there on this. And according to the National Survey of Employees that accept, those employees that accept counter offers, 50 to 80% voluntarily leave their employer within 6 months of accepting a counter offer because of not keeping their promises to them. According to the Harvard Business Review, they've done a lot of surveys on this over the last couple of years. 78% of all senior execs and 80% of all HR leaders, Heather, indicate that at some time it is acceptable to embrace the counter offer to your employee. According to the survey, 67.5% of managers have extended counteroffers, and more than 52% of employees in charge of hiring staff at their company have formal policy of making counteroffers, according to the Harvard Business Review. The study revealed that 43% of people surveyed believe they would take a counteroffer because it makes people more productive. 43% thought it said they gave more job satisfaction, where 58% of managers agreed that replacing anybody is a negative situation, and therefore the counteroffer is an ideal opportunity to stop decreasing staff performance, stop a negative impact, and 33% said it creates the trust issue that I'm sure we're all going to talk about today. The top 3 reasons why companies make a counteroffer was talent retention, 57%, retain employees' job knowledge, 49%, and save time in hiring a replacement, 43%. So we've not gone into the usual sort of data that we've come out, because I'm sure Ms. Sharp will come out with lots of data from certain areas. So today I'm joined by Heather and Paul Sharp. Paul Jacobs and Mr. Pye are on client site. So let's kick off, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of things that we want to talk about today on here. So the counter offers, do we see them as something that we have created over time, or is it simply the market as it is today?
Shall I kick off? I don't think actually this is exclusive to recruitment where recruiters are involved. So I don't think we've created it over time. I think a counter offer is a normal employer response to potentially losing a talented member of the team. So it feels to me like a normal part of the way an employer will respond. I think we publicize it because it's a massive pain in the ass for us as recruiters, and I think it's worse because of the market we're in today, which we'll come on to talk about more. But I think the counter offer has always been there. Paul?
Agree, and having been subject to one counter offer in my life, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I will support the data that Howard said earlier, which was that following that counter offer, I left 10 months later. So I think that the data is pretty profound and robust from my perspective. I think counter offers have been around for years. They've not gone, but I think what you've just said there is that the pressure in the labour market now is such that organisations are counter offering because they know that the cost and time and probability of them finding a replacement is so much harder now than ever before that they are counter-offering. And a really important stat that I came across, Howard, was 1 in 4 leavers are going to be counter-offered. Now, if you think about that from a recruitment perspective, when we're doing perm placements, the chances are we are going to have, on a monthly and cyclical basis, we are regularly going to have candidates that are offered jobs counter-offered. It's an absolute fact and a given for me. 1 in 4 get counter-offered. It's a fact.
I have to say, sorry, Howard, just to interrupt, but I'm really surprised it's as low as 1 in 4. You know, if you value your employee, why wouldn't you counter offer as an employer? So I'm surprised by the 1 in 4, but yeah.
It's interesting. Some of the big clients have out there, they have a no counter offer policy. I know people like IBM have a no counter offer policy because of various different things. And I think what we're saying is the counter offer has been out there for an awful long time, but today's market of counter offer is really what, have we created that? And I think what's happened, the pressure on the market and the pressure in the labor, the lack of labor out there, recruiters have started to take shortcuts. They are not interviewing the candidates with the in-depth, requirements that we did before. We're not strong enough on their reasons for leaving. We haven't really deep diving what the candidate truly wants, nor what they've actually got on the go. And because we've got, so much management pressure coming down, and from our clients and from our managers to get interviews, et cetera, then what we're finding is that we're putting candidates into the marketplace that we wouldn't normally put into the marketplace. And therefore we're seeing a massive influx or a higher influx of counter offers than we've seen before. And I think we're right, they've always been there. But now I think the pressure to retain staff is huge from the client's point of view. But it's all about that education, I think, on that.
I think maybe it's the fact that counter offers have always been there, but they're more successful now. So we're more likely to lose out on a placement because of a counter offer now, rather than that there are more counter offers.
So
last week we talked about money, and money is typically the main counter offer. And counter offers will go anything up to 25%. So this isn't a token gesture. This is material pay increase, whereby whether it's my 25% or Mark's 60%, that part of the workforce, if they resign, they're going to be offered a fairly substantial.
And this is where we talk about motivators. We talk about, I was thinking about it as the Febreze advert, where it says you've gone nose blind. Well, we go money blind when we have that counter offer given to us, don't we? And all of a sudden, all of those things that we forget are there, the reasons why we're leaving, suddenly become sort of a side issue. A money motivator, we know that the first week you get that money in your pay packet, it looks like a lot of money. Then the second month, it's a little bit more norm. By the third month, it's completely norm. It's now just accepted that you've had that. So I think, we've got to think about how that has manifested itself in the marketplace to get where we are today. I'm hearing lots of counter offers happening, but I'm also hearing lots of candidates dropping out or not turning up for interviews. Do we think then that this is part of the same problem?
So from a personal perspective, I think it is. And I think, Andy's made a good point there about the recruitment process, and I think that's absolutely spot on. Because I think, Howard, what you've just said about being under pressure and sometimes cutting corners, I think is relevant as well. I think with the rise of counter offers, the process bit is really important, and checking in with people on a regular basis is really important. Not just checking in for checking in's sake, but checking that their motivational factors for engaging with you from the onset has not changed. That's the key bit for me, where I think sometimes we rush the process to some extent, or we don't validate the emotional and motivational drivers as much as what we possibly should, or we don't spend as much time pressing those motivational drivers and validating them to the nth degree, because that ultimately is why the candidate is talking to you. And yes, there'll be some, basic needs around Maslow's hierarchy and everything else, but ultimately it's their motivational needs that are not being met, and that's the reason why they're talking to you as a recruiter. That's the bit where we've got to spend an awful lot of time really digging and really validating.
Heather?
I completely agree. So for me, if we're committed to the job, we're going to turn up for the interview. If we're not committed to the job, we're not gonna, we won't be bothered. If we've got massive choice, and somebody else comes along with something that's more interested, we don't feel we owe anything as a candidate to the recruiter unless we're emotionally invested with that person. So I think it comes back to all the things we've been talking about on all the other webinars we've been running about the service we as consultants provide to our candidates.
It's interesting. I was working with a client about probably 2.5 years ago, and they had a problem with the counter offer. And instantly the owner of the business, they had about 45, 50 staff. Instantly the owner of the business was, right, get me all the call stats, get me everything in here. And they recorded every call. Right, I want to hear all the calls. And I said, hang on a minute, why do we want to get all the call stats and listen to the calls? I want the call stats on the initial call. I want the call stats on the trial close, the pre-close. Let's see what's going on. And what we actually discovered was the problem with the counter offer wasn't the fact that the candidates were getting counter offered, it's because they weren't getting coached, and it went right back to the initial call. And when we started to look at it, they weren't trial closing in that initial call. When it got to the interview, they weren't trial closing. Pre-offer stage, they weren't pre-closing the client or the candidate. And then when it got to that closing stage, then you could see that it wasn't going to happen. And the reason why we discovered this, what I looked at was the closing at the offer stage, the interview prep, and the pre-offer, that offer stage when it's about to come from the client. All of those calls were less than 5 minutes. So it says there was no due process, there was no due diligence going on with regard to that. Once we changed that and we got a more in-depth interview process, more pre-closing going on, guess what? Our counteroffers massively shrunk and dropped very properly. So sometimes the surface problem of the counteroffer isn't the problem. It's what we were saying. We're going back to the actual recruitment process of shortcutting those processes and understanding that. So it's not just looking at that, it's digging into the actual process constantly and looking at what's going on. There's lots of posts on LinkedIn about the counteroffer situation. So do we think recruiters are close enough to our candidates to see the potential threat that they pose?
No. No is the short answer. No. So yeah, clearly some are and some aren't, right? So it's really difficult adjusting to a candidate short market for a lot of consultants. And so I think sometimes we're not close enough to our candidates, and also as recruiters, and we're naturally optimistic, aren't we? We want to believe that of course this is going to come off and nothing is going to get in the way. And we don't always think about the amount of work that we need to put in all the way along to be able to really nail this, particularly at the moment because we're seeing placements going off left, right and centre. And so the temptation to shortcut what we all know is best practice with all of those calls that you describe. So I think you're right, we're shortcutting things and we're not close enough often enough. That's a massive generalisation, because clearly there are many amazing consultants who are nailing this, and they are having issues with counter offers as well. But so it is all, it's getting more difficult and more challenging. But there is no doubt that if you're following that best practice and you are close to your candidates, you will get less dropout from counter offers.
Totally agree. I think for me, Howard, I think the gap between what an organisation wants to offer and what a candidate wants, I think that gap has got wider and wider over the last 18 months. So if you go back 18 months, 2 years, organizations wanted to offer a job a title, periphery benefits. They wanted to offer a package and a salary. It was about what they were offering. And I think, now we're in this, this particular candidate short market that we are, it's not about the package. It's not about the job title. People's motivations have genuinely changed for the vast majority of people. That's not to say money's not a factor, but we talked last week about things like hygiene factors and environment factors. These are really important things. So if we're not understanding to the nth degree what these motivational factors are for people engaging with you in the first place, then I think you're opening yourself up to an increased risk in the fact that that candidate will probably or could drop out the process at some point.
Yeah, and can I actually just add to that? It occurs to me that we make an assumption that all of our candidates understand the counteroffer culture. And actually, some candidates who are in the job early in their careers, for example, may have never come across it before. And so actually, we do have a responsibility to educate our clients about it. You know, in the piece I wrote on LinkedIn last week, I talked about this friend's son who was counteroffered by his employer. You know, he called me. There was no recruiter involved in this. This is a job he'd applied for directly. But he called me for some advice because he had no idea that when he accepted this job, earning loads more, that his employer would try to keep him, and he just didn't know what to do. He's in a real dilemma. So I do think there is a genuine piece of in recruitment where we assume that everybody knows what we know, and actually there are candidates early in their careers who have no idea about what a counter offer is and are looking for somebody to advise them on what to do and how to handle it.
So let's address that, because that's part of a further question further down the line. And I think, are we close enough? And what Deborah Austin's put there is absolutely right, is that, the reasons for leaving are really important, and that education piece is really important. But it's educating the consultants to understand that in that initial conversation with the candidate, but also with that initial conversation with the client, that those reasons for leaving need to be covered, but also the counter offer needs to be covered, and what's actually going to happen in the counter offer, and all that discussion about the emotional blackmail that comes out, etc., needs to be addressed within that first initial conversation. Because as you've said, Heather, there, some people aren't aware of that's actually happening. So, that loose bit of trial closing, and I'm saying you should be trial closing on every single call, and that trial close comes to a genuine pre-close when the client says, right, I'd like to offer. You pre-close the client and you pre-close the candidate before you actually make that offer to make sure it goes through. But we've got to start to think about the pressure that we put under, or our consultants under, to actually get those candidates through the process. And that's where I think we're shortcutting that initial process. And my view is always, if I was speaking to a candidate who was telling me through that interview process they already had lots of offers on the table, or they were already out with lots of clients, etc., instantly, once I've talked about my job, I want to know where my job grades with them. Is it the top job? Is it the second job? Is it the third job, etc.? I'd also want to know what job they're not likely going to accept out of the jobs that they've got on. So I want to know what my opportunity is. If they say I'm job number 5, then I would never be putting that candidate forward. But I don't think people are actually asking because they're scared to find out how many jobs.
Yeah, because our candidates are so rare, right?
Yeah.
The candidates are so rare. They are absolutely scared to ask that question.
But we've talked about this on numerous webinars about, it's not about having a client with multiple interviews that you've put into that client. It's also about now giving the candidate multiple opportunities, so that candidate can be exclusive to you. So if you give the candidate multiple opportunities, yet too many recruitment agencies that I come across are still going one candidate, one job, one candidate, one job, and yet really it should be one candidate, where can I place, where else can I place, where else can I place, and where else can I place, because they've all got 4 or 5 opportunities on the go. And that's what we've got to sort of understand, that we've got to get into that stage. So, if we're not close enough to the candidates, and again, I see lots of posts, pointing the finger, blaming the client, for what's going on. Are we truly educating the client enough, as well as we're educating the candidate enough?
And so I think, go on, Paul.
So I think this is where we definitely miss a trick. So there's lots of comments on the chat, which is brilliant, about people saying that they've got a process in place, they try and manage this from the onset. I think sometimes we forget we are the consultants in the recruitment industry, and I think sometimes we're a little bit too beholden to our clients, and I think equally our clients need our help and expertise. And points just been made about sort of face-to-face interviews versus Zoom interviews and MS Team interviews, and I actually do agree. So from the onset of a relationship with a potential new client, we have to be educating that client on what the candidate's motivational drivers are. We have to guide them. We can't just arrange an interview and trust the hiring manager, in my humble opinion, to just do a really knock it out of the park interview. We've got to be advising, we've got to be counselling.
Yeah.
You were a resource business partner, and having worked in-house, this is what I did. I guided my internal stakeholders I told them what, explained what the candidate was looking for, how, to get the best out of that situation, how we needed to marry up what we were offering versus what the candidate needs were. So you've got to almost be that resource business partner back to your client to try and get the best out of that relationship. And if you think about this, one of the reasons why people accept a counteroffer is that psychological contract, which has just been outlined on the chat about, the face-to-face bit. It doesn't materialize as quickly as what it needs to be. And that can be down to a facet of different reasons, but starting to build up that environment where somebody can feel really comfortable explaining what their needs and wants are and having an open dialogue and an open discussion is really important to building trust. So for me, an element of the reason why people drop out of the recruitment process is they don't feel they've started to build that psychological contract and the trust up enough with the new potential employer. If you start to build that up, and this is where recruiters have got a big role to play, then I think it's harder for people to accept a counteroffer. It doesn't get rid of it, but it does make it harder.
I think we've got to separate the two counteroffers, because we've got the counteroffer from their existing staff, existing employer, sorry, and then we get a counteroffer from a competitor. And that's what we're seeing. And I think a lot of the counteroffers that some of these people are receiving is the competitor. And I think, we're blaming the client, and it's about, to me, educating the client, because I still think the clients are still in the dark ages that, it's my company. Of course, they're going to want to work for me because I'm offering them a job and that I'm wonderful, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, the only person that thinks you're wonderful is probably your wife. So, or your husband. So you've got to start to, if you're lucky. Yeah, it's true.
My wife doesn't think I'm wonderful.
Yeah, she rings me and tells me that all the time, Paul. So what you've got to think is that we've got to educate the client, because what we've got to think is that, and I say this constantly to my consultants now as a thing, is your client going to physically turn up and mentally turn up for the interview? And they go, what do you mean? I said, well, physically they're going to turn up, but are they mentally tuned in? So one of the things that we did was we started to take the client out of their home environment, and we bring them into our office and have all the interviews in our office. And therefore the client isn't mentally being prepped by everybody else in the business. And guess what? When we brought a client into our office, we had a 92% retention rate of those candidates and offers being accepted. When we looked at interviews going on inside the client's office, we were lacking control of that. Obviously, it was dropping to around about 68%. So it sort of shows that you've got to get your client in the right frame of mind to actually woo the candidate, because most of them don't have a clue what's going on there. They just read the paper and go, well, it can't be really that bad, when it actually is. So they have to understand how to sell the candidate, how to close the candidate, how to sell the job, how to sell the business, so the the candidate can actually see that and feel that. And that's the emotional side that Paul's talking about, getting that emotional investment, because I think sometimes clients just don't turn up mentally to that interview and they leave the candidate on their own. And therefore a client that woos, and I remember having this conversation with a very large blue chip tech company, saying, just because you're a large blue chip tech company, don't think people are going to accept your offers. And it was only when we educated them and actually did a long training session with them that they actually started to change how they offered, but changed how they sold the business in the actual recruitment process. And guess what? Their offers start to increase. And it's very strange that lots of companies need to sort of be educated on that. And I think that's part of us as a recruiter, that we can get down to that. So educating who is the sort of thing that we should be thinking about. So who should we educate first? Should it be the consultant, the candidate, or the client?
Is that a trick question, Howard?
No, that's a question.
I don't think you can put one above another. You have to educate all of them. So our consultants have to be acting like true consultants, which is, we've talked about before, haven't we? In the way in which they deal with their candidates and the way in which they deal with their clients, and they go hand in hand for me. You can't do one without the other. You have to do all of them. If we miss any one of the three, we're going to get it wrong. And I think what I think it's Andy said, and I think Paul, you touched on it, that piece about, is remote Teams interviews impacting on this? Absolutely, it's impacting on this, and I think it's our job to educate people how to overcome that. Some people can't do face-to-face yet. Their organizations don't want them to, or they're doing more interviewing of people over who aren't going to be in their offices. They're going to work remotely, and so they've expanded the area they recruit in. So we're not going to go back to it all being face to face, and we have to educate consultants and candidates and clients about how much harder they've got to work when everything's being done remotely to get the psychological contract going. So I don't, for me, there isn't an order. For me, is you've got to do all of those things, and they're all equally important.
Totally agree. And I've just add one thing, going back to when I worked in-house, where I didn't think the manager had the skills or the process to interview people thoroughly. And if I thought I had, the ideal candidate, I would frequently join that interview process. And I think sometimes as recruiters, we sometimes, think we can't do that. Maybe we can do that, and we charge extra for it. This is another reason why you can fight for exclusivity, as an example. So it's just wrapping up the service in a slightly different way. If we are the best people at recruiting, then we should be using our expertise and knowledge and skill to guide both parties in the process. And sometimes I think we should be a bit bold and just say, we'll sit in on the first interview. Example. Coming back to that process bit, I've just had a thought, Howard. Again, one of the things I think we need to advise clients on is their process. So it's just not how they do it, but it's what they do. And again, how many organizations will have 4 interviews or 5 interviews? The candidate doesn't want that. The candidate thinks, the maximum should be somewhere between 2 and 3. So again, we need to guide the client from the onset in terms of what is the right process to get the best possible outcome, rather than turning people off and away.
And I think there's lots of talks about the process. So I'm going to be slightly controversial here. I think it is all about educating the consultant first. And the reason why I say that is because we are the people who put the candidates forward in the first place. So if we've got to start to blame anybody, we've put the candidate forward. If the candidate's accepting a counteroffer, then we are part of that. And therefore, we need to have our part played and understand that. So if you look at that about the manager is putting pressure on the consultants via KPIs, et cetera, et cetera. And so the question that I'd ask anybody on this call, and this is where we start to think about, do we understand the recruitment process? Do we understand the hygiene factors of the candidate, what they're going to accept, why they're going to accept, what have you? Okay. The question I'd always ask is, and this is something that I drilled into my consultants constantly, was if you get that recruitment sixth sense, that gut feel that the candidate's not going to accept the offer, and how many times do I hear this? I knew they weren't going to accept the offer. I knew the counteroffer was coming, but they'd never addressed it. The question is going to be then, how often do you pull candidates from the interview process or from the recruitment process because you know they're not going to accept an offer? Or do we leave them in the process because we think that looks good to the client, and the client thinks that the client can change that person's mind? And I think that we probably aren't pulling enough candidates from the process at this moment in time, because we're afraid to pull the candidates because it's such a candidate short marketplace. And yet what we're actually doing is showing to the client is that we haven't got a really good understanding of what our candidates truly want, or what our candidates actually have on the table at the time. So I think we've got to start to be a little bit more aggressive, because it's our part of the role. It's our job. We're putting the candidates forward. And it's the same argument that I had with a person on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago. I put a post out about, should we be calling everybody who goes into the recruitment process? And by the recruitment process, I mean, you've submitted their CV. And he said, no, we should not be calling, and candidates are dropping out left, right, and centre from interviews, etc. And I said, well, that's not the candidate's fault. It's our fault. We've put the candidate forward in the first place. Are your processes strong enough? Yes, some candidates are going to fall through that gap. And yes, as someone said on here, some candidates aren't going to tell you that they have everything on, but you will still get that little bit of a sixth sense of what's going on. And therefore, I think we need to educate the consultants first, then the clients, then the candidates, of what's going to happen within that marketplace, because we are in control. And what Paul's saying is that we get out of control at certain stages, but the places that we are in control, if we are not brave enough to do those type of things, then we are not in control. The candidate is in control all the way through if we're not brave enough to pull the candidate out of the process. And I think we've got to really think about that.
I just want to come back to Karen D's point. I think it's spot on. I think it's a really good comment, and that reaffirms, I think, the point that I was just trying to make earlier, which is about, training. And I think this is your point, Howard, is training people, the consultants, to be very consultative and to be experts in the recruitment process, rather than just somebody who's managing a process and pushing candidates out into the client's ether. I think Karen D's point is absolutely spot on for me.
So like last week, I'm gonna test Paul Sharp's counting capabilities here. Okay, like last week, if we could give tips, okay, one tip to the consultant, one tip to the candidate, and one tip to the client on what they could change in the recruitment process to prevent the counter offer, what would they be?
So as usual, I'm not going to do the process. I'm going to do something completely different. So I think, what was going through my mind, Howard, is, with a candidate bit, and we're in this candidate short market, which everybody's talking about, how often do we go back over the candidates that have been counter-offered and stayed in that environment? If we know that they're going to leave within 6 to 12 months, then how often do we keep in touch with them? That would be an interesting exercise for any one of the people on the listening in to actually go away and do. I'd be really interested in the data.
Do you know, that's a great question, Paul, not to interrupt, but you know exactly what the answer will be on that. They're dead to me. They've counter-offered. They're dead to me. I'm never going to talk to them again, but put them on the blacklist. Let's bury them in a hole. Let's kill them. They've been counter-offered. That's what the recruiters think. Yeah, but you're right.
But if we're in a candidate short market, why would you
correct
keep the relationship alive? So that's point number one. Point number two, again, just coming back to this candidate short market, and somebody's on the listening today, and I had this conversation with them a few weeks ago. It's just how often do we go back over the candidates that we've had out on interview over the last 12 months or 24 months, and how have we kept in touch with those individuals? Sometimes I think we push people forward for interview and then we start again. And this comes back to your point, Howard, about making sure we stay really close to candidates and doing lots of work with them rather than putting them forward for one interview. So make sure that we're constantly using those candidates to try and fill other roles going forward. And I think the last bit I just had comes back to the point which I said, which is train the consultants to be very consultative. Don't be afraid to actually take control of the process. And I think this is where we've got to be a little bit ballsy with our clients. We've got to articulate what the process is and how it will work to get the best outcome. And sometimes that means you've got to control the process with the client better and more robustly and tightly than what we would normally do.
Heather?
I will stick with your specific question of 3 tips, one for each, Howard. I was tempted to go with something completely different, like Paul, just to wind you up, but I won't. So my tip for clients would be make sure your hiring managers understand how important recruitment and recruitment process is at the moment. It's not secondary to your job at the moment. It's absolutely primary to your job. So for goodness sake, speed up and focus on it. How often do we have clients who just don't seem to understand the urgency of getting this stuff done and having way too long between stages and between feedback? So for goodness sake, focus on this and speed up is what I would say to clients. To candidates, I would say, remember your recruitment consultants on your side. They are your partner too. They are helping you on your journey. So open up to your consultants, trust them. We have to earn the trust clearly, but this is a tip for candidates. That's what I would want to say to candidates. And my tip to consultants is have confidence in yourself. You know more about recruitment than you think you do, and you certainly know more about it than your client and your candidate. So have the confidence in yourself and your service to do what Paul was talking about, and to just be a bit ballsy about controlling and communicating and educating so that all the parties understand how to get the best out of the experience.
So I think, Heather, our Christmas present to Paul is the count from Sesame Street that I can count to 3. 1, 2, 3. So
I can think of a better present.
My 3 would be when he starts to look at the consultant first and foremost. And I think it is getting the consultant to actually understand the importance of a true, thorough interview process. And what that interview process actually means. The quicker we go through that interview process, then the less information we get on that. And that means really fully understanding the candidate's reasons for leaving, and then highlighting what that counter offer process is going to look like right from day one. And then if we then start to introduce those at the end of every call, and I teach my guys at the start of every call, what's changed since the last time we spoke, because I want to know, have they got more jobs on, have they got less jobs on, etc., etc. But also at the end of every call, I'm going to say, you know, if all things are equal, this is what's been happened, this is what you've said. If the my client came and offered this, would you accept, based on all the information that you've got? And I'm constantly trying to dig for information that either opens the crack up that says, actually, I think they're going to drop out, or it cements it over, and I'm getting more and more confident that my candidate is going to accept what was going on. When I then flip it into the candidate's point of view, what I would say is I want to train the candidate constantly and remind the candidate constantly on the reasons why they are leaving. And then I remember saying this to candidates, and I remember sort of someone in the office stopping me and going, oh my God, I've never thought about that. I would never tell a candidate to Google counter offers. I would always tell them to Google why not. You know, we say why not to accept a counter offer. Okay. And I always say, Google why accept a counter offer, because there's very few things written about why to accept a counter offer. When looking at the research here, I found another one that I'd not read before, but there was still all back from year dot. You know, there's very bits written. So I want to explain to the candidate what happens. I want to explain to the candidate the emotional blackmail that the client is going to put you under once you walk in. And so I've got to understand that the candidate, as you said earlier, that understands that. And then the final one from a client's point of view is all the time when we're talking to a client, you know, we've got to work hard on preparing the candidate, but also the client. And this is where I think what Paul was alluding to a little bit is where we can sell extra services to the client. You know, why can't we be in on client interviews? Yes, we should be on more, but why aren't we going in to train them on how to interview, train them how to offer, train them how to sell the job, the business, etc., and actually work really hard on developing our client relationships? What we tend to find is that we are creating a longer relationship with our clients, but spend little time creating relationships with our candidates. And so to me, what we've talked about all the way through this bit is the better relationship we have with our candidates and with our clients, the more honest they will be. The more you are honest with your candidate, the more likely they're going to tell you early on if something's going to change or something's going to happen. But the fact that we rush the process and they see us as just pushing a bill through, we're going to get you through the job and that gives me the invoice and that gives me my commission. We need to treat them as people and as a product, not as a cash cow. And that's the big difference. And that's the thing that I'd look at, that we need to look at that. The final bit on the candidate is what I'd go to is we're very good at prepping them for interview, but the biggest interview that the candidate is having at the moment isn't with the client they are going to. It's with the client they're resigning from. And so I'd be doing a massive interview prep on resignation and helping them go through that resignation process so that they understand what the client is going to say to them during that resignation process. So we've got to make sure that we understand that. So the final question for today, Dave Pye is not here today.
Was that three?
It was three. It was three.
It was three. He did a Paul Jacobs version of the
three. Correct.
Well done.
Dave Pye, although he's not here, is famously saying for we need to slow down to speed up. And in this case here, you know, the question is, what do we need to slow down and what effect will that have to speed up our processes and the number of placements that we get?
So I'm going to be controversial and say this is one of those where I actually think we need to speed up and not slow down. We need to speed up the things that we've talked about doing. We need to speed up how much time and effort we put into controlling the process. There's one point that I just want to touch upon quickly, which is the one thing that candidates want is feedback. The one thing that organizations don't want to give is feedback. So this is where we've got to bridge that gap. We build trust by soliciting people's opinions and showing appreciation. We build trust by being consistency and establishing that relationship. And so we've got to be quicker out the starting block, because everybody is looking for candidates. Everybody's approaching everybody. It literally is like the Wild West out there. So I actually think this is the time where we've got to be quicker, but we've got to be better and quicker.
Yeah, nicely put. The things we need to be doing are exactly what we talked about at the beginning. So it's making sure we're listening, that we're understanding, that we're prepping, that we're following the process that we know works, that we're getting all of the information that we need to be able to know whether you do that quicker or faster or slower, or I don't know, but we've got to do it properly. We can't take shortcuts. We can't miss out bits of the process. We have to have every conversation and get all of the information before we put candidates forward to clients. And that's all of the processes with our candidates and all of the processes with our clients.
I just want to add one other point, Howard. We've got to speed up the training that we give our teams. That's another thing. We've got to be really on the ball with this. We can't cut corners as leaders. We've got to invest really heavily and make sure we're properly training people with this.
So I think, to me, there's three distinct phases in the recruitment process. There's that search phase, the interview and offer stage, and post-offer stage. And exactly what you're saying there, Paul, we need to treat each stage correctly and train our consultants to deliver each stage perfectly. And the more we put pressure on them to hit a simple KPI, the more pressure comes to cut corners. And I think if we in truth think about it, we're probably really good at stage 1 and stage 2, but there's lots of improvements that we can do on that. But stage 3 we're probably really poor at, because we've made the offer and then we daren't speak to the candidate just in case they drop out, and we're waiting for that dreaded call to say he's not turned up, or I'm not going, I've taken something else, where really that's, to me, is the most important stage that we need to start to push. And yes, people are still going to fall through the cracks. Without a shadow of doubt, people are going to fall through the cracks. But what it's going to do is going to increase our capabilities of making a better informed decision on who we actually put forward for the jobs and how we do that. Let's not be in a rush to put everybody forward just because they've got a skill that matches. Are they actually going to take the job? Will they do the job, or can they do the job? Will they take the job? Are the two most important questions that we need to answer to ourselves. And if we can't get that, yes, they will take the job, we've got a little gut feeling, I would then be investigating that gut feeling really important, massively. So we've got to start to think that it's not all about the candidate or the client. A lot of it falls at our doorstep and how we need to address that. So what you're saying, Paul, training is absolutely paramount. Having the confidence to be consultative is absolutely paramount. And thinking that when we look at the data that's happening and what's going on, let's not just look at the surface data, let's look at what leads that data to get to the stage it is. And sometimes it's not the fact that they are being counter-offered, it's the fact that we haven't coached them how to do that, whether it be the client or whether it be the candidate, etc. But most important of all, we're not coaching our consultants to be able to actually deal with that. And it is a really, I think your description there, Paul, of it is the Wild West out there, is absolutely right. It is the Wild West out there. But if you're the biggest gunslinger in the Wild West, then you're the person that's in control. And I think that's the big thing, that we are not as in control as we should be. And I will challenge the interview process on Zoom and video and things like that. To me, that gives you more opportunity to control the process. Absolutely more control, because you can introduce the candidate, introduce the client, you can sit and listen, you can record it, you can hear what's going on, you can see what's going on, you can influence it. Where before, the dreaded call of my candidate's now in interview and you're sat there in your office and you're nowhere near your client, you've no idea what's being said. Well, now you can hear it, you can see it, you can control what's going on. So we need to control the process. We need to control the process more. So to me, that is what we'd be doing. So counter offers are going to be here. You know, they're never going to go away because they've been here for time immemorial. We've just got to get better at dealing with them. And that means getting better at understanding the candidates' drivers, the clients' drivers, and our consultants' drivers, and training people to actually deliver what we need rather than shortcutting it just because we want to hit a KPI.
And Howard, I'd be really keen, genuinely keen to hear from anybody who would like to take me up on the offer to look at how many candidates they've had out on interview over the past 12 months and what the percentage fill rate is from those candidates, and what percentage of candidates have they done further work with that were counter offered. So there's 2 questions. I'd be really, really keen for somebody to answer that. And I promise to keep the data anonymous, but I'd be just really keen to understand what people find.
So next week, we're going to move on to talent management and talking about talent management and can we sell talent management to our clients. Beginning of October, we presented at the Expo down in Birmingham about how to take on the big boys. And this is all part of that. How can we sell a bigger service, a better service to the big boys? So we're going to touch on a lot of things that we talked about in that presentation. So you get an opportunity to see that. So we hope to see you all next week. Thank you very much for your time. It's been much appreciated. Thanks for all your comments and all your remarks. You know, it's always good when it's interactive. We love that from there. So enjoy the rest of the week, guys. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Heather and Paul, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it for this week.
Thank you.
Thank you.